My family went camping every summer when I was growing up. It was just one of those things we did, part of the rhythm of our lives. We'd pack up the car with sleeping bags, coolers, tarps, and tents, and we'd head out for a few days into the woods or down to the shore. We usually bounced between Virginia Beach, Assateague Island, and Westmoreland State Park. Each place had its own feel. Virginia Beach was crowded and full of people, but it was fun to play in the water. Westmoreland was more quiet, but I hated it there. Something about the dark woods and old cliffs gave me a bad feeling. But Assateague was something else. If you've never been, Assateague is a barrier island off the coast of Maryland and Virginia. It's known for its wild ponies that roam the beaches and marshes, living free on the sand dunes and salt flats. I remember the first time I saw them when I was little. I thought they were magical, but they aren't. They're rough little things, skinny and shaggy, and they'll steal your food if you leave it out. Still, there was something special about camping near them. It felt wild and different. This particular trip I remember more than any of the others. I must have been around 9 or 10. It was summer, probably July, and it was hot. The air was thick and sticky, full of the smell of salt and wet sand. We got to the campsite in the late afternoon after driving for what felt like forever. My dad set up 2 tents, one for him and my older brother, and one for me and my mom. The tents were a bit apart, maybe 20 or 30 feet. We had a small fire ring and a picnic table between them, and beyond that, a sandy path that led through the dunes to the beach. I remember helping my mom unpack things while my dad hammered in tent stakes. The ground was dry and full of sharp grass. We had to watch where we put our hands because there were prickly burrs everywhere. The sun was low, turning everything golden. The ponies were already wandering nearby, heads down, grazing on the grass. I kept watching them, amazed by how close they got to people. That night, after we ate hot dogs and marshmallows by the fire, I remember lying in the tent with my mom, listening to the sounds outside. You could hear the waves crashing, soft and steady, just over the dunes. There were insects too, a constant hum of crickets and mosquitoes. I remember scratching at my arms because the bites were already swelling up. My mom was reading a book by flashlight, and I was staring at the roof of the tent, watching the shadows of the trees shift in the wind. Eventually, we both fell asleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was late. The moon was high, shining through the mesh window of the tent. I remember feeling hot and sticky, like the air inside the tent had stopped moving. At first, I wasn't sure why I was awake. I just lay there, blinking at the ceiling, wondering if I had to pee. Then I realized my mom was sitting up. She was perfectly still, her back straight, her head turned toward the window. I could just make out her profile in the moonlight. It scared me a little because she wasn't moving, just staring. I remember feeling my heart speed up, and I whispered her name, but she didn't answer. I turned my head to see what she was looking at. Outside the tent, just on the other side of the mesh, was the silhouette of what looked like an old woman. She was hunched over, her long hair hanging in thin, wiry strands. I could see the outline of her arms, the slope of her shoulders. She was leaning toward the tent, looking in. I froze. My whole body went cold. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but it terrified me. Why was there an old woman out here, in the middle of the night, staring into our tent? I started to whisper to my mom again, asking her what that was, who it was. My voice was shaking, and my hands were clutching the sleeping bag. Then, just like that, the figure outside startled. It jerked back, and I saw the shape shift and change. Suddenly, the old woman turned, and I realized it wasn't a woman at all. It was one of the feral ponies. In the moonlight, the long hair I thought I saw was its mane, tangled and wild. The hunched shape was its back. The pony had been curious, maybe looking for food, and had come right up to our tent. But when I made noise, it spooked and took off, trotting away down the sandy path. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still pounding. My mom reached over and squeezed my hand. We both lay back down, listening to the sounds outside. The soft clop of hooves on sand, the rustle of dry grass. The next morning, everything looked normal again. The sky was pale blue, the sun already heating up the ground. I walked outside the tent and saw the pony tracks in the sand. They led right up to where we had been sleeping, then away toward the beach. My dad and brother were already up, cooking breakfast on the camp stove. They hadn't heard a thing in the night. I told them about what we saw, and my dad just laughed. He said we had probably set up the tent on one of the ponies' regular trails, and they were just passing through. He told me to always pack up our food at night because the ponies would go through anything they could reach. I remember feeling a little embarrassed, realizing how scared I'd been over something so harmless. But that night, it had felt anything but harmless. The rest of the trip was uneventful. We spent the days swimming in the ocean, collecting shells, and walking up and down the beach. At night, we sat by the fire watching the stars. I kept glancing at the ponies in the distance, wondering if any of them were the one that had come up to our tent. When we packed up to leave, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I was glad to go home, to sleep in my own bed, but part of me knew I'd miss the wildness of Assateague. Even now, years later, I can still remember the way the moonlight looked on that pony's mane, the shape of it framed against the tent, how my heart raced when I thought it was something else. Looking back, I realize how easy it is to let your mind play tricks on you in the dark. Out there, in the middle of the night, when everything is quiet except for the sounds of nature, your imagination fills in the blanks. I thought I saw an old woman, a stranger peering into our tent, but it was just a wild pony, curious and harmless. That memory stuck with me, though. It taught me to respect the wild, to understand that when you camp out there, you're not alone, you're in their world. You have to pay attention, be careful, and know that nature doesn't care about your fears or your comfort. When I think about camping now, I remember the heat, the mosquitoes, the smell of smoke in my hair. I remember the sound of waves at night, the sight of stars so bright they lit up the sky. And I remember that pony, standing so close I could hear it breathe, framed in the silver light, just a part of the world we had stepped into for a little while. I've been back to Assateague since then as an adult. The ponies are still there, just as wild, just as scrappy. And every time I see one, I think about that night, about how small and soft we are compared to the wild around us. It's humbling in a way. Camping teaches you that you're not in control, not really. You can bring your tents and your gear and your flashlights, but you're just a visitor. The island, the woods, the animals, they were there before you, and they'll be there after. That's the real lesson I took from those summers, from that night under the moon on Assateague. Not fear, not superstition, but respect. A reminder that out there, you're just another part of the landscape, another small creature under the sky, hoping to make it through the night. It happened years ago, back when I was in my 20s. I had always loved being outdoors, hiking, camping, just spending time in nature. There was something about being away from the constant noise of the world that calmed me. No phones, no cars, no screens. Just trees, dirt, sky, and air. I would go camping alone sometimes, though I knew people thought it was strange. I didn't care. I liked the quiet. That summer, I decided to take a long weekend and head up to a spot I'd read about in a camping book. It was a small, remote campground near a lake, tucked deep into the woods of northern Pennsylvania. The book said it was lightly used, with only a handful of primitive sites, no running water, and no cell service. That sounded perfect to me. I packed up my gear in my old beat-up car. Tent, sleeping bag, tarp, food, water jugs, small stove, and plenty of bug spray. I also brought along a book, a journal, and a fishing rod. I didn't plan to do anything complicated, just sit by the lake, fish a little, read, maybe hike some trails. I wasn't looking for adventure. The drive up was long and slow. I remember the roads getting narrower the farther I went, turning from wide highways to small state roads, then eventually to cracked old two-lane blacktop winding through the hills. I passed through a few small towns, the kind with only one gas station and a diner, then kept going until even the towns disappeared. By the time I reached the turnoff for the campground, it was late afternoon. The gravel road into the site was rough. My car rattled and shook as I bounced along, dodging potholes and fallen branches. Trees crowded both sides of the road, their branches arching overhead, making it feel like I was driving into a tunnel of green. I remember feeling a little thrill in my chest, that mix of excitement and nerves I always got when I went somewhere new and isolated. When I arrived at the campground, I found it empty. There were 6 sites in total, scattered along the shore of a small lake. A narrow dirt path ran around the lake's edge, weaving through the trees. The sites were simple: a cleared patch of ground, a fire ring, and a battered old picnic table. No bathhouse, no ranger station, just nature. I chose a site near the water, farthest from the entrance. I liked the idea of having the space to myself with no one else nearby. I parked, got out, and stretched, breathing in the fresh air. It smelled like pine, damp earth, and a hint of lake water. Birds were calling in the trees, and I could hear insects buzzing. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the ground was flat and free of sharp rocks. I spread out my sleeping bag, organized my gear, and set up the little stove on the picnic table. By the time everything was ready, the sun was low over the lake, casting long shadows across the water. I made myself a simple dinner, soup and bread, then sat by the water watching the light fade. The evening was quiet, peaceful. I watched dragonflies dart over the water and saw fish jump, sending ripples across the lake's surface. I remember feeling a deep sense of contentment, like I was exactly where I was meant to be. That night, I went to bed early. The woods were alive with sound: crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. I lay in my tent, listening, feeling the cool night air seep in through the mesh windows. I remember thinking how small I felt out there, alone in the dark, surrounded by the vast, indifferent forest. At some point in the night, I woke up. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was a noise, maybe just a shift in the temperature, but I found myself lying awake, staring at the roof of the tent. The moonlight cast pale shapes through the fabric, making the branches outside dance like ghostly fingers. I lay there for a long time, trying to go back to sleep, but something kept me awake. I felt restless, uneasy, not scared exactly, but alert, like my body knew something I didn't. I listened carefully, hearing only the usual night sounds: the insects, the occasional splash from the lake, the rustle of wind in the leaves. Then I heard something different. It was faint, but it was there. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, deliberate, not the scurrying of a raccoon or the bounding of a deer. Something heavier, something moving with purpose. I froze. My heart started pounding, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps came closer, stopping just outside the tent. I lay perfectly still, every nerve on edge. I knew the tent fabric was thin, offering no real protection, but I didn't want to make a sound. I told myself it was probably nothing, a curious animal, maybe another camper who wandered over by mistake. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I was the only one there. I had seen the empty sites. No one else had come in. The steps moved again, slow, circling the tent. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot, the gentle swish of something brushing against the tent wall. I kept my eyes wide open, heart hammering, gripping the sleeping bag tight. Minutes passed, maybe more. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I was left in silence again. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that, but eventually exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted back to sleep. In the morning, the campsite looked normal. Sunlight poured through the trees, birds sang, and the lake sparkled. But when I stepped outside, I saw the prints. They were faint, but they were there. Boot prints, circling the tent, pressing into the soft earth. Not animal tracks, human. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. No cars had come in, no other campers had been there. Who had been walking around my tent in the middle of the night? I walked the entire campground, checking every site. Empty. No fresh tire tracks on the gravel road. No signs of anyone. Just me. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I fished, I hiked, but I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling that uneasy prickling at the back of my neck. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside sent a jolt through me. The next morning, I packed up early, cutting my trip short. I didn't want to stick around and find out if whoever or whatever had been there would come back. Driving home, I kept thinking about it. There was no logical explanation. No ranger, no hikers, no campers. Just boot prints circling my tent in a place where no one should have been. But here's the strange part, the part that, for some reason, cheers me now. Nothing happened. I was fine. I think about that sometimes. How close we can brush against something unknown. Something that makes the hair on our arms stand up and still come out the other side untouched. How the world is full of things we don't understand, moments we can't explain, and yet most of the time we're okay. It reminds me that life is both fragile and resilient, that I can be alone in the woods, terrified, and still wake up to birdsong and sunlight. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I probably never will. But every time I think back on that trip, I remember the beauty too. The lake, the trees, the quiet, the sense of being small but alive in a vast world. And maybe that's why the memory cheers me. Not because it wasn't scary, but because it was, and I'm still here. I still go camping. I still walk into the woods alone, set up my little tent, and sleep under the stars. I still listen to the sounds of the night, knowing that the world is bigger and stranger than I can ever fully grasp. And every time I do, I remember that weekend, and I smile. Because even when we brush against the unknown, even when fear tightens its grip around us, most of the time we make it through. We pack up, we go home, and we carry the stories with us. That's life, I guess. A mix of fear and beauty, darkness and light. And for some reason, knowing that makes me feel better. It makes me feel lucky. It makes me feel alive. When I was a kid, my family used to camp a lot. Every summer, we'd pack up the car, fill it with our old, worn camping gear, and head out for a few days or a week. We never went anywhere fancy. Most of the time, we stayed at state parks along the East Coast. Virginia Beach, Westmoreland, and sometimes Assateague Island. Assateague was my favorite. The island was wild, beautiful, and full of life. And, of course, it had the famous feral ponies. I loved those ponies as a kid, even though we were always warned not to get too close. They were part of the magic of the place. This story happened one summer when I was about 10. We were camping on the Maryland side of Assateague, right near the beach. My parents had picked a site tucked back in the dunes, close enough to hear the waves but far enough that we weren't right on the sand. We had 2 tents set up, a big one for my parents and little brother, and a smaller one just for me. I was old enough by then to want my own space, and my parents let me have it as long as I stayed close. That evening was calm and warm, with the kind of salty air that makes your skin feel a little sticky. We ate dinner at the picnic table, cleaned up, and then wandered down to the beach to watch the sunset. I remember how the sky turned shades of orange and pink, and the ponies wandered slowly across the dunes in the distance. By the time we got back to the tents, it was dark. My parents made sure the food was packed away. The last thing you want is an animal rummaging through your stuff at night, and then we all said goodnight. I crawled into my little tent, zipped it up, and lay down on my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside. Camping at Assateague is never completely quiet. You can always hear the waves crashing, the wind rustling the grasses, the calls of shorebirds, and sometimes the soft, muffled sounds of the ponies moving in the distance. I drifted off to sleep feeling happy, safe, and tired. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a loud noise that woke me, but more of a feeling, like my brain suddenly snapping alert. I lay there, blinking in the dark, trying to figure out what was different. The moonlight filtered faintly through the thin tent fabric, casting soft silver shapes on the walls. I could hear the wind outside and the steady rush of the ocean, but something else too. Quiet sound, right outside my tent. I held my breath, listening hard. It was a soft shuffling noise, followed by a faint snort. Something was sniffing at my tent. First, my heart leapt with fear. I was a kid, and all I could think about was some wild animal creeping around. My mind raced through every scary possibility. Coyotes, maybe even a bear, though bears weren't really a thing on the island. But then, after a few seconds, I realized what it probably was. Pony. I relaxed a little, though not entirely. Even though the ponies were familiar, they were still big, strong animals. We'd been warned many times not to approach them or feed them. They were wild, unpredictable. But still, the idea of a pony standing outside my tent was a lot less frightening than some unknown predator. I lay perfectly still, hoping it would move on. But it didn't. The shuffling continued, and I could see a dark shape blocking part of the moonlight through the tent wall. The shape was tall, with a long head and neck. The pony was right there, inches away, maybe checking to see if I had any food. I heard the soft snort again, followed by a faint scrape, like a hoof shifting on the sandy ground. My heart was pounding now, not in terror, but in that strange, nervous excitement that comes when something big and real is happening. I imagined the pony's big eyes, its long, wiry mane, the way its breath must be fogging the cool night air. Suddenly, the tent wall bowed inward slightly, as if the pony was pressing its nose against the fabric. The whole thing trembled for a moment, and I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it not to push any harder. I lay there for what felt like forever, but was probably just a minute or two. Eventually, the pressure on the tent eased, and I heard the soft shuffling sound again as the pony moved away. I waited, heart still racing, listening carefully. The sounds faded, and soon all I could hear was the wind and waves again. I didn't fall back asleep right away. I stayed awake for a while, staring at the pale shapes on the tent walls, thinking about that pony and wondering if it would come back. The next morning, when I crawled out of my tent, the ground was marked with hoof prints. They circled around my tent and led off toward the dunes. I followed them a little way, just to see where they went, but they quickly disappeared into the grasses. When my parents got up, they saw the prints too, and we all agreed that one of the ponies must have wandered through the campsite during the night, probably checking for food. My mom smiled and said something like, "Well, I guess they just wanted to check in and make sure everything was okay." We spent the rest of the day exploring the beach, watching the ponies from a safe distance and enjoying the sunshine. But that night, when I crawled back into my tent, I felt a little different. I kept thinking about how thin the walls of that tent were, how close the pony had been, how easily it could have pushed through if it wanted to. It was a reminder, I think, that when you're out in nature, you're never really separated from the wild. The animals, the land, the elements, they're all right there, just outside the thin fabric walls we put up. That's part of what I loved about camping, and still do. That feeling of being small, being part of a bigger world, where anything can happen. I didn't see the pony again that trip, but I always remembered it. The soft snort, the shape in the moonlight, the way it lingered just long enough to leave a memory. Even now, years later, when I go camping, I sometimes lie awake at night and think about that moment. Not because it was scary, though it was a little, but because it was real. It reminds me that nature isn't just a backdrop or a pretty picture. It's alive, it's close, and sometimes it comes right up to the door of your little tent, just to check in. That's the story. A nice pony came by to make sure everything was okay. And somehow that makes me smile every time I remember it. When I was younger, every summer meant one thing: Boy Scout camping trips. And out of all the places we went, Assateague Island was always my favorite. If you've never been, Assateague is a barrier island that stretches along the coast of Maryland and Virginia, famous for its wild ponies. But that's not all it has. There's the ocean, the marshes, the sand dunes, and this raw, untamed feeling you don't get at the usual campgrounds or parks. It always felt a little wilder there, like you were stepping into a place where people didn't fully belong. Our troop went there almost every summer. I have so many memories tied to that place. Long hikes through the sand, salty breezes, campfires at night, tents rustling under the stars. I even remember seeing my first set of topless sunbathers there when I was about 13, which, as a young teen, left a pretty big mark on my memory. We were walking back to camp from the beach, and there they were, stretched out on the sand, carefree, laughing in the sun. We were a bunch of awkward kids, half shocked, half thrilled, and it became one of those stories we whispered about for years afterward. But aside from the funny or awkward stuff, Assateague also had this other side. A quiet, strange side that only showed up if you stayed still long enough. if you were by yourself, away from the rest of the group. I didn't think much about it back then, but there was always this sense that the island had its own rhythm, its own rules. One summer, something happened that I've never really forgotten. It was late July. Our troop had set up camp at one of the group sites near the dunes. We had about 4 or 5 tents lined up, a couple of folding tables, coolers packed with food, and a fire pit ringed with stones. The adults were there too, of course, our scoutmaster and a couple of parent volunteers. During the day, we did all the usual things. Swimming in the ocean, building sand forts, trying to skim board, hiking through the marshes. We even got a good look at the wild ponies that wandered through the campsites, though we knew better than to get too close. At night, we gathered around the fire. We cooked hot dogs and marshmallows, told dumb stories, and passed the time until the grown-ups told us to quiet down. One night, I woke up early, really early, probably around 4 a.m. I had to pee, and the cool night air had crept into my sleeping bag, making me uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it for a while, but eventually, I gave up and crawled out of the tent. The camp was dead quiet. I looked around, half expecting to see someone else awake, but all the other tents were zipped up. Still, the moon was bright, casting a pale glow over the sand and grasses. You could hear the waves, faint and steady, off in the distance. I walked a little way away from the tents to find a spot. Once I was done, I just stood there for a moment, looking out toward the dunes. That's when I noticed something strange. Farther down the beach, maybe a couple 100 yards away, there was a flicker of light. Not the pale moonlight or the soft glow of the stars, but the warm, shifting glow of a fire. That struck me as odd. Campfires weren't allowed on the beach at Assateague, at least not officially, and even if someone was breaking the rules, why would they be doing it in the middle of the night? I stood there, squinting into the dark, trying to make sense of it. And then I saw the shapes. At first, I thought they were just shadows cast by the fire. But as I watched, I realized they were people. A group of them, maybe 10 or 12, moving around the fire in a slow, uneven circle. I felt a prickle crawl up the back of my neck. They weren't just standing there, they were dancing. Not like at a party, not like kids messing around. This was different. The movements were slow, almost rhythmic, and the figures were all bare-skinned, their pale bodies catching the firelight in flashes. I froze. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Part of me was curious, wanting to get a closer look. But another part of me, a deeper, more cautious part, told me to stay put. I watched as one of them picked up what looked like a drum and began to beat it, softly at first, then louder. The sound drifted faintly across the sand, a steady, thumping rhythm that matched the sway of the dancers. I remember standing there, barefoot in the cool sand, feeling like I'd stepped into something I wasn't meant to see. It wasn't scary exactly, but it was unsettling, like when you accidentally walk in on something private, something you don't understand. After a few minutes, I decided I'd seen enough. I turned and slipped back into my tent, pulling the zipper closed as quietly as I could. Lying there in the dark, I listened hard, half expecting the drumbeat to come closer, half imagining the dancers creeping up through the dunes toward our camp. But the sound stayed faint, distant, until eventually it faded into the background noise of the waves and wind. The next morning, I got up early and walked down the beach to where I thought I'd seen the fire, but there was no sign of anything. No ashes, no driftwood, no footprints. Just smooth, untouched sand. I didn't tell anyone in the troop about it. I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding weird, and honestly, I wasn't even sure what I'd seen. Maybe it was just some locals or visitors, maybe a group of campers doing their own thing. It didn't seem dangerous, just strange. Still, for the rest of that trip, I found myself glancing down the beach every night, wondering if the fire would appear again. But it didn't. The rest of the summer passed like all the others. More hiking, more swimming, more campfires, more pony sightings. I eventually stopped thinking about that night so much, though every now and then it would drift back into my mind. Years later, I still remember it clearly. I think about how wild and unpredictable Assateague felt back then. Not just because of the ponies or the ocean, but because of the people, the moments you stumbled on without meaning to, the glimpses of other lives you didn't fully understand. That morning, standing barefoot in the sand, Watching a group of strangers dance around a fire under the moonlight, I felt something I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was something close. It was the realization that the world is full of strange, unexpected things. That no matter how many rules you follow, no matter how carefully you plan, there will always be parts of life that catch you off guard, that remind you how little control you really have. And somehow, I've always found that both unsettling and oddly comforting, because it means there's still mystery in the world, still things to wonder about, still moments that stay with you long after they've passed. Even now, when I think back to my summers at Assateague, I remember the good times, the funny moments, the little adventures. But I also remember that early morning, that quiet drumbeat on the wind, and the flicker of firelight in the distance. And I'm glad I saw it, even if I never fully understood it. It's just one more thread in the long, tangled memory of growing up, of learning how wide and strange the world can be. When I was about 24, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I had done plenty of trips with friends, family, or hiking groups, but I wanted to try something different this time. Just me, alone, in the desert. I picked a spot in Arizona, near the edges of a state park where people camped, but not too many. It wasn't one of those popular campgrounds packed with families and RVs. I wanted quiet, isolation, space to breathe. I packed my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, extra tarp, plenty of water, food, first aid kit, flashlight, backup batteries, knife, hiking boots, extra socks. I even had a detailed map printed out, even though I had GPS on my phone. I knew not to trust signal in some of these areas. I got to the spot late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip. The desert was cooling fast, the dry air turning sharp against my skin. I set up the tent on a flat patch of dirt near some rocky outcroppings. There were little scraggly bushes, dry grasses, a few cactus plants. The place looked empty, quiet, like the world had been paused. That's what I wanted. Once the tent was up and my stuff was inside, I sat on a small folding stool and watched the sun finish setting. The desert sky turned gold, then orange, then a deep purple. Stars came out one by one, clearer than I'd ever seen back home in the city. It was stunning, and it gave me a little thrill, knowing I was out here completely on my own. After making a small meal, some instant noodles and jerky, I cleaned up carefully, sealed away anything with a scent, and checked around camp with my flashlight before turning in. I didn't want to deal with raccoons or coyotes or anything sniffing around. Inside the tent, it was quiet. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the soft wind outside, the occasional rustle of dry grass. For a while, I felt really good, calm, peaceful. But after an hour or so, I started to get restless. I hadn't noticed how uneven the ground was when I set up the tent. There was a little ridge under the ground sheet pressing into my lower back, and a few small rocks I'd missed when clearing the spot. I shifted, tried to get comfortable, but I kept feeling that pressure. Finally, frustrated, I decided to step outside and smooth the spot under the tent, or maybe move the tent a little. It wasn't too late, probably around 11 p.m., and the moonlight was strong enough that I could see without the flashlight. I unzipped the tent and stepped out barefoot, figuring I wouldn't be long. The air was cold now, sharp against my skin. I moved around to the side of the tent, crouched down, and started feeling under the floor, pressing at the bumps. I didn't see exactly where I put my foot as I shifted, balancing on the loose ground. That's when I felt it. A sudden, sharp pressure under my right foot. Not a sting yet, not quite, but something was there, something hard and strange. I froze. Very carefully, I lifted my foot. My heart was pounding, my breath caught in my throat. I turned the flashlight on, shaking fingers fumbling with the switch. And there it was, a scorpion, a big one. Its pale body was half hidden in the dust, but the thick pincers and the curled-up tail were easy to make out in the beam of light. I looked closer and realized the stinger was bent. It must have been under my foot at a weird angle when I stepped on it, and the pressure had pinned the tail down or bent it just enough that it couldn't snap forward. My stomach turned over. I backed away slowly, heart hammering in my chest, every nerve on edge. I watched the scorpion for a long moment, expecting it to lunge or snap, but it just twitched slightly, then scuttled off into the dark. I stood there, shaking, trying to process how close I'd just come to getting stung. Out here, alone, miles from help, a scorpion sting could have been a big deal. Maybe not deadly, but enough to ruin the trip, enough to cause real problems. I checked the area carefully after that, shaking out my boots, inspecting my sleeping bag, looking all over the tent ground sheet for anything else hiding. Every shadow, every rock, every stick started to look like a threat. When I finally got back inside the tent, I couldn't relax. I lay there, wide awake, listening hard to every sound outside. Every tiny rustle in the grass made me jump. I imagined scorpions crawling under the tent floor, sneaking into my sleeping bag, climbing into my shoes. The hours crawled by. At some point, the air grew even colder, and I huddled deeper into my bag, but I didn't dare fall fully asleep. My mind kept racing, replaying that moment over and over, the feel of the thing under my foot, the shape of the stinger bent back, the thought of what would have happened if I'd stepped just a little differently. By the time dawn started to light up the sky, I felt exhausted but wired, like I'd run a marathon without moving. I got up early, packed my stuff carefully, checking every item, every bag, every corner of the tent. I didn't want to take any chances. When I finally hoisted my pack and started the long hike back to my car, the desert looked completely peaceful again, as if none of it had happened. The sun was rising, casting soft gold light over the rocks and sand. Birds were calling faintly in the distance, and the wind stirred the dry grasses. I felt shaky, drained, but weirdly grateful. Could have gone bad, very bad, but it didn't. On the way home, I kept thinking about how fragile the line is between a good trip and a disaster. One wrong step, one careless moment, and things can turn. That close call stayed with me. It wasn't some dramatic survival story. I didn't get lost or hurt. I didn't need rescuing. But the quiet near miss, that moment where I stood on a scorpion, completely unaware, and walked away unharmed, reminded me how easily things can tip the other way. After that trip, I started paying a lot more attention on my hikes and camps. I double-checked everything, watched the ground carefully, thought about where I put my hands and feet, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because nature doesn't care if you're paying attention or not. It's just there, waiting, going about its business. And sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you walk away, but it only takes one moment for everything to change. Even now, years later, I still feel that moment under my foot. The sharp shape, the hidden danger, the lucky break. And every time I head back into the wild, I remember it. Not to scare myself, but to remind myself that respect, care, and awareness are the only things that keep us safe. The desert doesn't care if you're careful or careless, but you should. I spent years in the Army, most of it in upstate New York, stationed at a place surrounded by thick woods, cold winds, and a kind of dampness that never really left your skin. We trained out there a lot. Days, weeks, sometimes longer, we were always in the field. If you've never done Army field time, let me tell you, it's not pretty. You're always cold, always wet, always tired. You eat what you can when you can, and you sleep in short snatches, never really relaxed, always half watching for what comes next. You carry everything you need on your back, every pouch, every strap carefully arranged so you can reach what matters. I never thought the scariest part of all that time in the woods would be raccoons. Let me explain. We were out there on one of those long stretches, a 2-week exercise deep in the woods. It was late fall, the trees mostly bare, the nights cold enough that your breath came out in clouds. The ground was hard, covered in dead leaves and sharp sticks, and every little movement crunched like a gunshot. We'd set up our sleeping spots under tarps, no tents, just low covers stretched between trees to keep the frost off our faces. The first few nights, I was too tired to notice much. We'd march all day, train until dark, and then collapse into our bags, boots still on, rifles at arm's reach. But after a few nights, once I settled into the routine, I started picking up on little things. I'd wake up feeling lighter. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I'd pat around my vest, my gear, and realize something was missing. A pouch unzipped, A snack bar gone. A glove pulled halfway out. A canteen shifted. I thought maybe I was losing things, being careless, but I knew I wasn't. In the army, you don't leave your kit loose. You check it, double check it before you sleep. One night, I stayed up late, sitting under the tarp with my knees pulled up, watching the fire we'd built burn low. I heard something rustling out beyond the light, just at the edge of the trees. Small sounds, the dry crackle of leaves, the faint scrape of claws on bark. I figured it was a raccoon. They were common in those woods. I'd seen them during the day, fat little things waddling along tree branches or darting across trails. But that night, something about the way they moved caught my attention. I saw one come into the circle of firelight. It was bold, moving with purpose, heading straight for one of the guys' kits. It nosed around a pack, then, with quick, clever paws, started tugging at a zipper. I sat there watching, too tired to care much. I figured the guy would wake up and scare it off. But then I noticed another one, sitting a little further back, just outside the firelight. Bigger, heavier, with a thick, bushy tail and a broad head. It wasn't rummaging. It was just sitting, watching. I watched as the little one worked, pulling out an energy bar, dragging it away. The big one stayed put, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The next night, it happened again. I tucked everything away, zipped and strapped down tight, but I woke up to the sound of soft rustling. I cracked my eyes open, just enough to see. 2 raccoons were at my kit, working together. One tugged at a pouch while the other slipped in behind it, pulling out whatever it could reach. And a little further back, in the dark, the big one sat, watching. I told myself I was imagining things. I was tired, half dreaming, filling in gaps with my mind. But the next morning, more things were gone. A snack bar, a pair of socks, a plastic spoon. Little things, but they added up, kept happening. Every night they came back. They got bolder. They worked faster. And always the big one stayed back, just watching. One night I decided to stay awake, really stay awake, and watch. I sat up under my tarp, rifle across my lap, eyes half closed but alert. I waited. The woods were dead quiet. The fire was out. The only light came from the moon, silver and sharp, casting long shadows across the ground. I heard the rustle, the faint crunch of leaves, the soft snuffling of noses. They came in low, moving like little thieves, creeping toward the packs and vests we'd stacked neatly near our sleeping spots. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. They worked with this weird, eerie patience, each one focusing on a task. One pulling, one searching, one carrying things away. And there, further back, the big one sat. Its head moved as the others worked, watching them, watching me. I stayed frozen, heart thudding. I told myself it was just raccoons, just dumb animals. But deep down, I felt something else. A weird, crawling unease. Because they weren't acting dumb. They were organized. The next morning, I checked my gear. More things gone. A pouch unzipped, a glove missing, a small first aid packet gone. I tried to shake it off, but it kept gnawing at me. On the last night of the exercise, I decided I'd had enough. I set a trap. I put out a few things. A snack bar, a shiny piece of metal, a small pouch, and I sat back, hidden in the shadows, waiting. They came, quiet, sure-footed, slipping through the trees like little ghosts. They headed straight for the bait, ignoring everything else. I saw them moving together, signaling with little chirps and clicks, working as a team. And behind them, the big one sat. I don't know why, but something in me snapped. I stood up, stomping forward, waving my arms. They scattered, except the big one. It stayed put for a long, long moment, its eyes fixed on me. Then, slow and steady, it turned and melted back into the trees. The next morning, we packed up. I was exhausted, rattled, but relieved to be heading back. We hiked out, loaded into trucks, and rode back to base. I thought about it the whole way. I've spent time in rough places. I've dealt with danger, with fear, with the tension that comes when you know something could go wrong. But that feeling, the feeling of being watched, studied, outwitted by a bunch of raccoons, that was something new. It wasn't that they were dangerous, not really. They weren't going to hurt me. But the way they moved, the way they worked, the way the big one sat back and let the others do the job, that stuck with me. Back on base, I checked my gear carefully, putting everything back in order, making sure nothing important was missing. And that night, when I finally crawled into a real bed, under a real roof, I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about those nights in the woods. I still swear to this day they were organized. I picture that big raccoon, the one that sat back and watched. I imagine it rallying the others, planning the moves, keeping watch. Sounds crazy, I know, but when you've spent enough time out there, when you've been cold and tired and half-starved, when you've seen how the wild things move and think and survive, you start to understand. We humans like to think we're in charge. We like to believe we're the smartest ones in the room, the top of the chain, the masters of the land. But out there, in the dark, under the trees, in the cold hush of the woods, we're just another animal, just another shape moving through the night. And sometimes the creatures we laugh at, the ones we think are dumb or harmless or funny, they're the ones who really know how the game is played. I'll never forget those nights, not because I was scared of the raccoons, but because, for the first time, I realized they weren't scared of me. When I was 24, I took a trip that stuck in my memory ever since. I'd been an outdoors person most of my life. Grew up hiking with my dad, camping with friends, fishing, and just being out in the woods whenever I could. So when my college roommate, Jason, invited me on a week-long camping trip in Colorado, I didn't even hesitate. We planned it for early summer. It was going to be me, Jason, and his cousin Tyler. We wanted something quiet, something far from the popular trails packed with people. Jason found a spot deep in the San Juan Mountains, a long drive out and then a long hike in. No real campsites, just backcountry. It was the kind of place where you carry everything you need, and once you're out there, you're on your own. That was exactly what we wanted. The first couple of days were great. We hiked deep into the forest, passing through long stretches of pine and spruce, the air thin and crisp. We crossed creeks on fallen logs, scrambled up rocky slopes, and found a meadow where elk had bedded down, their tracks stamped into the grass. At night, we set up camp beside a cold mountain stream, cooked over a little stove, and sat up looking at the stars. It was perfect, but on the third day, things started to feel off. We had left the wide open meadows and were moving into thicker forest. The trees grew closer together, their trunks dark and the canopy above thick enough to block out a lot of the light. The ground was soft with needles, and it felt like the sounds of the forest were muffled. No bird calls, no rustling squirrels, just the quiet crunch of our boots. We were following a faint game trail, working our way toward a small alpine lake Jason had read about. We wanted to make camp near it for the night, but as we hiked, I started to get the sense that we weren't alone. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but I kept hearing things. A faint snap of a branch, a rustle in the brush just off to the side. Once or twice I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just animals. Deer, maybe a fox, but it still made the hair on my neck stand up. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was starting to drop behind the peaks. We set up camp quickly, got the tents pitched, and got water boiling for dinner. The lake was beautiful, still and glassy, reflecting the orange and pink sky, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. There were faint sounds outside, soft footsteps, maybe, or something brushing against the tent. Every time I sat up and held my breath, the sound stopped. I told myself it was just small animals, maybe raccoons or something poking around for food, but deep down, I didn't believe it. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something heavier, a crunch in the dirt, a scrape like something dragging along the ground. I lay there, heart pounding, gripping my sleeping bag tight. The sound circled the tent slowly, then faded away. In the morning, I checked around the campsite. There were no obvious tracks, no signs that anything had been there, but I knew what I'd heard. We broke camp early. None of us said much, even Jason, usually the chatterbox, was quiet. We packed up and decided to push farther along the trail, maybe swing wide and loop back toward the main trail over the next couple of days. But the feeling didn't go away. As we hiked, I kept sensing movement in the trees, just out of sight. I'd glance back and catch a dark shape slipping between the trunks, or hear the faint rustle of branches swaying after we passed. At one point, we came across a clearing, and Jason stopped short. In the center of the clearing, half hidden under a fallen tree, was the carcass of a deer. It had been dead a while. The body was half decayed, ribs exposed, the head twisted at an unnatural angle. But the strangest thing was that the area around it was completely silent. No flies buzzing, no birds picking at it, no scavengers of any kind. Just the smell of rot and the still, heavy air. We didn't stick around long. That night, we set up camp on a rocky ridge, away from the thick forest. We figured we'd be safer on open ground, where we could see anything approaching. But I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I woke up with a start. Sure, I'd heard something. A faint scrape, a soft thud, the whisper of something brushing against the tent fabric. My heart hammered in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. At some point, I don't even know what time, I sat up and unzipped the tent quietly, poking my head out. The moon was out, casting pale light over the rocks and trees. I scanned the ridge, looking for movement, and then I saw it. Down at the edge of the trees, maybe 50 yards away, stood something. It was tall, too tall to be a person, but too thin to be a bear. I couldn't make out details, just a long, narrow silhouette. It stood perfectly still, facing our camp. I ducked back into the tent, heart pounding, and sat there until dawn. By morning, it was gone. We packed up as fast as we could and started hiking out. We didn't talk about what I'd seen. I wasn't even sure I wanted to bring it up. Maybe it had just been a shadow, a trick of the light, exhaustion messing with my head. But as we moved through the forest, I kept feeling like we were being followed. Once, we passed a tree with deep gouges clawed into the bark, fresh enough that the wood was still pale and raw. Another time, we found a patch of ground where the pine needles had been scraped aside, leaving dark, disturbed soil. We pushed hard that day, covering more miles than we'd planned, desperate to get back to the main trail. By late afternoon, we reached it, a wide, well-trodden path leading back toward the trailhead. The moment we stepped onto it, the tension lifted, like we'd crossed an invisible line. We hiked out the next day, and when we reached the car, none of us looked back. We never went back to that part of the mountains. I've thought about it a lot since then, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a bear, maybe a moose, maybe some other animal I just didn't recognize in the dark. Maybe it was nothing at all, just fear playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know we ran into something we weren't meant to see. Something that owned that stretch of forest. Something that watched from the shadows and let us leave. We were lucky. Sometimes the wild has things in it you can't explain. Things that don't show up in guidebooks or park brochures. The locals have a name for it, I've heard, the Colorado Nope. I don't know what it really is, but I know it's out there.